Hello and welcome to our webinar entitled Seven Lessons from Over 1,000 Different Implementations Over 20 Years. My name is Eric Kimberling. Thank you for joining today, this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're dialing in from today. Before we get started, I'll go ahead and give a quick introduction before we dive into the agenda and the details of today's session. But today's session obviously is entitled 7 Lessons from Over 1,000 Different ERP Implementations Over 20 Years. And really what this webinar is intended to show today is some of my lessons and experiences from having worked with over 1,000 different implementations in some capacity over the last 20 years. And really answering the question, if I had to do 7 things correctly on my ERP implementation, what would those 7 things be? And this is a subset of a white paper that we're about to publish that outlines 20 things that are very important for an ERP implementation, or the 20 most critical things that you should do. So today, in the interest of time, we'll give you a highlight of some of those things and focus on the things that I think are the 7 biggest ones. And we actually have a bonus one that we've thrown in as well that's important as well. But just a little bit about my background. I've been in the ERP consulting space now for about 20 years. I started my career at Pricewaterhouse. For several years, I was with them doing organizational change management on larger ERP implementations, primarily for Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 organizations. Throughout my career, I came to the realization that there weren't many independent consulting firms out there that really understood ERP and digital transformation, and also had independence to be able to represent clients and do what's best for clients versus doing what was in their own self-interest. So with that in mind, I had started a company called Panorama Consulting in 2005, and then just recently left Panorama after having been there for about 12 years and started Third Stage Consulting with some of the best of the industry that I've worked with over the years that I've been in this industry. So excited to do this webinar. This is actually the first webinar we're doing under the Third Stage brand. So excited to kick things off with a bang, and I appreciate you all being here today. So if I can move forward here, the agenda for today is, first of all, we'll cover the objectives of today's webinar. We'll talk about some of the things that we hope you'll take away. I'll give you a brief overview of Third Stage Consulting. Many of you know me under different company names, so many of you may be curious who is Third Stage and why am I part of Third Stage now as opposed to other companies I may have been involved with in the past. So we'll answer some of those questions for you in just a couple minutes, and then really the bulk of the presentation here today will be an overview of typical implementations. We'll talk about what differs between a typical implementation and what a successful implementation looks like. And then we'll get into some of the top 7 lessons from successful transformations. And again, these are the 7 things that if someone came to me and said, hey, what are the 7 things I should do well in my ERP initiative? These are the 7 things that I would suggest as kind of the top priorities. And then finally, I'm going to leave a few minutes at the end for questions. So any types of questions you have, feel free to submit those using the chat button or the chat tab. On the right side of your screen, you should see a little chat tab where you can submit questions to me, and I'll get to those at the end of today's session. So the objectives of today's webinar, first of all, is to understand what makes typical ERP implementations fail, or at the very least, what makes them less successful than their more successful counterparts. And there's a number of different things that organizations typically struggle with. And that's really what we'll talk about today, is how do we overcome some of those landmines and pitfalls, and how do we ensure that we are doing things that are appropriate for our implementation, putting us on the right track towards success. So we want to help identify the ways to begin your project on the right track. So ideally, if you're watching this webinar here today, you're about to start an implementation. You haven't gotten too far into the implementation. However, if you're in the middle of an implementation or toward the end of an implementation that's maybe in trouble or not quite going the way you want it to, you'll still get some good takeaways from today's session. But in a perfect world, you're watching this video before you really get too far into your implementation. And really what I want to do is ensure that you have some best practices you can use to make your implementation successful. And even though I've been through plenty of implementations, most of them successful, I've also had some that were very difficult, some that were challenging. In fact, they're all difficult and challenging, but some obviously went better than others, and some were more challenged than others. So I have plenty of battle scars and wounds to show for some of those experiences, and that's really what I want to share with you today, and hopefully help you avoid some of the same mistakes I've made through my career, and what I've seen other CIOs and IT directors and IT managers make through their careers as well. So the first question you may be asking is, how could you possibly have done 1,000 implementations in just 20 years? And I'll be honest, I have not done full life cycle, me being the single project manager for implementations 1,000 times. I don't know that anyone has. I don't know if there's enough time in one's life to have done 1,000 implementations in that capacity. But when you look at the different implementations I've been involved with in some capacity, it is well over 1,000. So that includes projects, especially earlier in my career, where I was doing the hands-on implementations, which over time, quite frankly, those become less and less as far as me being the day-to-day project manager and managing those implementations. But when you look at things like expert witness cases, I've been involved with several dozen of those types of projects. Plenty of project recoveries in my career where we'll come in as part of a team, or I'll come in as part of a team and do kind of a SWAT team approach where we come in and figure out what's broken, how can we fix it, and how can we get things back on track very quickly. That's a pretty good subset of those 1,000 implementations. And then also providing the third-party QA and IV&V oversight. So even if I or our team wasn't the direct project managers, providing that oversight and that third-party involvement in the third-party oversight and QA of those projects was a big part of my experience. And then more recently, in recent years, being a part of steering committees. So every client that the organizations I've worked for over the last several years, every client we had, I was typically part of the steering committee. So I would be on every steering committee update. I would understand what the challenges were. I'd work through those challenges with the executives from the client. And so that's really been, between the executive steering committee and the expert witness cases, that's been a majority of my direct involvement in the last several years. But I'm also drawing from experience, having actually been the project manager, in some cases working underneath a project manager earlier in my career, to understand some of these lessons. And one other thing I'll say too is many of you may be asking, well, I'm implementing SAP, or I'm implementing Microsoft Dynamics or Infor or Oracle, whatever the case may be. What are the best practices for that particular type of implementation? And what I'd say about these lessons we'll talk about today is they're very technology agnostic. You can plug in at really any software product, whether it's cloud or on-premise or tier 1 system or tier 2, single ERP, best of breed. It really doesn't matter what technology you're talking about. These lessons apply to all different types of implementations. In fact, I've been involved with SAP implementations, Oracle, Microsoft, Infor, Epicor, a lot of best of breed, Salesforce, Workday. So a lot of different types of implementations. And at the end of the day, when I back up and look at that broad experience, it comes down to these same 7 things, regardless of the software that you're implementing. So very technology agnostic discussion we're going to have here today. And this applies to whatever type of system you might be about to implement. So before we dive into the best practices and some of those lessons, let's talk a little bit about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. So Third Stage Consulting Group, as I mentioned, it's a company that I've started. I'm the CEO of. After having been at Panorama Consulting for 12 years, decided it was time for me to launch something different, and a company that was truly independent, a company that had a very seasoned group of consultants. Again, this team that we have at Third Stage is hand selected by me. So these are people that I have worked with either at Panorama or other organizations through my career that are, I would consider, the best consultants in the industry. We're very focused on business. So yes, we understand technology. We understand the ERP space and digital transformation space, obviously, but understanding business is even more important. So whether a company is a manufacturing and distribution company, a retail organization, services, whatever the case may be, we want people that really understand business and know how to marry technology with business processes and people to transform businesses. So that's really the kind of the crux of who we are. We're thought leaders. I mean, many of you probably know my blogs and webinars and that sort of thing. That thought leadership comes with me over to Third Stage, and that's a key part of who we are as well. And probably most important, we are 100% software, hardware, and industry agnostic. So we don't play the games that you commonly see in the ERP industry. We don't have side deals, backroom deals with clients or vendors or system integrators. There's no creative ways around, trying to skirt the independence. We are 100% independent. We don't engage in pay-to-play schemes or anything like that. So independence was the reason I first kind of got into this industry on my own back in the early 2000s, and it's something that's very important to me and something that I stay true to, and that's a core value of who Third Stage Consulting is. We also have a set of values that are extremely important. This is one thing, having been through this now for the second time, starting an independent ERP consulting firm. This is something I did not do the first time that was very important to me to do the second time around. And in hindsight, when I first started my last company, I would have definitely done this to make sure that I was creating the culture and the values and bringing on, the partners and employees that match these values. And so that's something that's very important with Third Stage, is that we have a set of values that we aren't going to compromise or deviate from. One is the independence, as I mentioned, as you look on the left side of the screen. I do apologize, it's a bit blurry. I don't know if any of you are having the same blurriness that I'm seeing on my screen, but I think it has something to do with my internet connection not being fast enough or whatever to make this look well. But hopefully you can at least see the titles. Independence is the first one. Client focus is the second one. A lot of consulting companies are worried about themselves more than they worry about clients, and I'm very adamant about being client focused and doing what's right for the clients, not just in terms of being independent, but putting together solutions that make sense for that given client. So there's a lot of best practices and tools and methodologies I've learned through my career, but I'm not a fan of force fitting those for clients. There's a lot of times where you need to tailor that for clients and not force your checklist or your way of doing things into certain client situations. You have to know when to draw from different tool sets. So we have experienced enough consultants on our team that they know when and where to draw from those tool sets, and also when to tailor some of those tool sets for our clients. The third is collaboration, not just amongst ourselves within Third Stage, but more importantly with clients and also industry peers. One thing I really want to do with Third Stage, and that's very important, is to make sure that we're not battling or sparring or butting heads with industry players, whether it be other consulting firms or system integrators or vendors. And a lot of consulting firms in the industry don't have a good reputation in the industry and haven't done a good job of collaborating and working well with their peers. And that's something that is different about Third Stage, is we do work very hard, and we will continue to work hard to work very closely with industry peers, in some cases even competitors. So there's something to be said for competition and again, getting back to the second value, just doing what's best for the client and not worrying so much about, how big is our share of the pie, or how big is it compared to others or whatever. So that's an important value, as is intelligence. We hire very smart people that know this industry well. We don't hire junior people and then try to train them to learn ERP and digital transformation. We don't try to force fit methodologies and just get experienced people to take those methodologies and try and use them with clients. These are people that know this industry very well, and they demonstrate it in the thought leadership. We demonstrate it in the way we work with clients. And you could argue that the most important one, maybe it's first or second on the list somewhere up there, but integrity, very important. I mean, that's something that I won't deviate from. That's very important for Third Stage, and we're not going to compromise that, is the integrity of the company. Being above board, how we deal with clients, being above board, how we deal with vendors and system integrators, that all is very important. And that's something there's not nearly enough of that in this industry. And then finally, focusing on the important things. What I mean by that is, not getting too caught up in what services make the most sense for us, but focusing on what's going to make a client successful. So for example, if we know that organizational change is going to make a client successful, which typically it will, that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on doing what we do well and doing what the client needs, and focusing on those important things rather than just doing what's best for us or doing something that doesn't make sense for the clients. So we provide a number of different services, primarily focused on ERP implementations. We do also do some software selection. We do quite a bit of digital strategy. So helping clients define their overall direction. But one thing I will say that's different about third stage is we don't believe in long, drawn out, convoluted, overcomplicated, cumbersome software evaluation projects. Though that's a thing of the past. That's an outdated approach. That's typically what a consultant does when they don't know the market very well. They're going to draw out the software selection evaluation process to 3 or 6 or 9 months. That's not what we believe in. We'd rather see our clients make a decision, even if you're not 100% certain that it's the 100% number one decision. We'd much rather see you invest that time and money in successful implementation, because I'll take any day if I were a betting person, which I'm not at all, but if I was, I would bet any day on the company that invested time and money in a really good implementation, but they weren't so sure about if they chose the right software. I'll bet on that company any day over the company that was 100% sure they got the right software selected. They spent a year on the process and they kind of fizzled out and lost momentum and couldn't really implement well. I'll always take that first option. So we do digital strategy, software selection. We want to make sure there's a clear direction and that we've got alignment and that we know what the needs are and we find the right software. But we've been doing this long enough that you don't need a long drawn out process to get to that decision. In addition to that, and within implementations, we do organizational change, business process management. We provide project management, PMO types of services to help clients kind of be their advocates or their an extension of their project managers to just help manage, vendors, system integrators, that sort of thing. We do quite a bit of expert witness work. That's something that I still do quite a bit of. And then we also provide staffing for people that need specific resources specific to certain software. And then we also do ERP software industry research analysis and market positioning too, just based on our knowledge and thought leadership in the industry. That's another service offering we provide. So this is just a bit more of a breakdown of some of those services. I won't spend a lot of time here. I think hopefully you get the idea of the general gist of what we do. We're independent. We help clients through their entire life cycle. We work with a lot of integrity. We collaborate. We bring in the right system integrators because we don't have these backroom deals where we're biased or tainted by, what's going to make us some money. We make money from our clients. We don't make any money whatsoever from the vendors. So that's an important part of who we are. So basically anything to help a client through their transformation, whether it be an ERP project, CRM, HCM, some kind of best of breed, whatever that is, we're the guys to do it, the guys and gals to do it, I should say. So that's a bit about us. And more importantly, let's talk about implementations and overview of some of those typical implementations and what they look like. And this ties back to the naming of third stage. And, why did I name the company Third Stage? For those of you that know me or have known me for a while, you'll know that when I started Panorama, that was there's a meaning behind that name, but it was actually inspired by an album and a song from the Cars. So I'm a big rock and roll guy. I like musical references. I like to tie things to music. It's a passion of mine. And Third Stage has a musical reference as well. It's actually the name of Boston's third album, for those of you that are old enough to remember or know the band Boston from the 70s and 80s. That was their third album. And the reason that name kind of stuck with me and why I really liked that was because it had such a important connotation. For me personally, Third Stage was kind of the third stage of my career in this independent consulting space. I had my first company was Panorama Consulting Group. The second phase was when I brought on a couple different business partners about 5-6 years ago. And now Third Stage is my launch, off on my own with key team members that come from my past to launch Third Stage. And then finally, and probably most importantly, when we look at ERP projects, there's a three-stage approach here. And it's, by the way, a rocket analogy too. So, I'm not an aerospace and defense expert by any means, but I know enough to be dangerous. And when you're launching a rocket, a multi-stage rocket, typically the first and second stages will kind of get you up to a certain point, and then the third stage rocket is the one that kind of splits off from the two, and then it gets to the final height and speed that it's intended. So it's really about it's kind of a visual or an analogy, I guess you could say, or metaphor, I guess you could say, for what ERP projects struggle with. A lot of them never get to that third stage. They can't quite get the momentum to get off the ground and keep going, and they get stuck somewhere along the way. So the first stage is what I would consider, project failure. If a project only gets through the first stage, it's pretty much a failure. They either haven't completed the implementation, or it's been an unmitigated disaster. Not many companies get stuck in that stage, by the way, but a small subset do. Most projects get stuck in the second stage, and that's where you implement the software, but you only implement partial scope for whatever reason. You run out of money, you run out of time, the project just gets kind of held up or whatever. You have budget and time overruns. Sometimes that's a challenge as well. Limited benefits realization and no ROI, and then also operational disruption. Companies that are brought to their knees, can't ship product, or for several weeks or months or however long the stoppage may be, they have some type of operational issues. And so the second stage is where a majority of companies get stuck, and then most of them stop at the second stage. But the ones that get to that third stage, the ones that get that full lift and that full heightened speed, to continue with that metaphor, those are the ones that complete the implementation expected. They're on time and on budget. The ROI is realized. They're self-sufficient. They're continuously improving the software after the fact. And I don't want to say that there's any company out there that just easily gets to that third stage. Everything's fine. Everything's perfect. There's a lot of challenges along the way. I mean, there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of pivoting. There's a lot of, adjustments and things that need to happen. But there is a big difference between the companies that reach that third stage and power through it and know how to get through it versus the ones that get stuck on the first or second. So that's a little bit about kind of the typical ERP project and some of the challenges that organizations have with their ERP and digital transformation projects. So with that, that being said, now what is it that gets the companies into that third stage? And this is really the whole premise of today's webinar is what are the 7 things? If I had to pick 7 things to do, what would they be? And these are those 7 things. And this is a kind of a laundry list of sorts right here. It's a lot to take in, but these are the 7 that we're going to walk through right now. And again, these are the things that I'd advise to any company about to start on a project. So we're going to walk through these and kind of unpack them one by one. If there's something I don't get to or that you have questions on or you want me to dive into that I didn't, just feel free to send me a chat and I'll be happy to get to those get to those for you. So let me get to the slide here. Bear with me. There it is. All right. So the first lesson is that failure can be avoided. A lot of times companies think that, if they pick, I'm going to pick on SAP for a minute just because they're the biggest players and they get picked on a lot. But a lot of times people think if we pick SAP, we have a higher likelihood of failing because it's such a big software and there's, known failures out there involving SAP. What I would say is it's not because you chose SAP that you failed or that you might fail. It has nothing to do with the software you chose. It's how you implement it. So, and it's due to how you implement it. It's not due to luck. There are best practices that apply to whether you're implementing SAP or Oracle or Microsoft Dynamics, whatever it is. You need to be doing the same things to ensure that those projects are successful. So these best practices we're talking about today are technology agnostic, as I mentioned before. They're very important, and they're things that will help you through your project, regardless of which technology or technologies you might be implementing. And the thing that's interesting is when I look at successes and when I look at failures that I've either seen or been a part of, they all kind of look the same. The successes look very similar to the other successes. The failures look very similar to the other failures. You see a lot of the same common patterns. The ones that are kind of in that second stage that we talked about, where they aren't really successes or failures. They're just kind of mediocre at best and leave a lot to be desired. Those share some of the same attributes as well. So there's a lot of commonalities here, and that's some of the big challenges that we have here. Is making sure that we understand what those best practices are, and we want to make sure we don't settle for mediocre results. So a lot of times companies go in thinking, okay, as long as we don't fail, we're in good shape. As long as we get past that first stage, we're in good shape. And what I would say is you really should be striving for that third stage, because it's going to be hard enough to get there with that as a goal. If you set your sights lower, you're just going to underachieve those goals because these projects are so difficult. So ensuring that you don't settle for mediocre results is very important. So that's really the first lesson, is to understand that failure can be avoided. Success can be achieved. It's not luck. It's due to the best practices. It's due to the way you implement the software. It has nothing to do with the software you choose, or very little with the software you choose, I should say. I mean, I suppose it's possible if you choose a system that's a complete mismatch with what your needs are and you try implementing it, you have a pretty limited chance of success in those cases. But again, as long as you know what you're doing or have people that know what they're doing to help you choose software, you're going to find a system that's going to be a decent fit for what you need. And then it just becomes more of a focus on what do we do to make this project successful. The second lesson is to ensure that you have a clear digital strategy to start the project. A lot of times companies they get caught in this situation where they've got this old legacy system that's 20, 25, 30 years old. It's custom code. It's got a lot of customization. The people that developed it aren't around anymore. There may not be a vendor out there to support it anymore, and the company's growing, and there's just a lot of strain on that system. And so there's a mindset that, well, we have to replace our system. That's what our strategy is to replace this old legacy system. It's nothing more, nothing less. And that's a pretty dangerous spot to be in. And quite frankly, a lot of clients that I've worked with over the years fall into this trap, is they think, well, we have no choice. We have to replace the system, so we're going to replace the system. And I'm not saying that's not a good reason to change out your system, but it's not a good enough reason to change your systems. You need to have a very clear strategy of what is it you're trying to accomplish, what are the goals and objectives of your overall organization, and how is this project going to help achieve those goals and objectives beyond just get off that old system because we can't support it or we can't sustain or scale with that system. We need to be looking at, what efficiencies do we expect, what top line revenue growth do we want to see, what are some of the strategies that we will deploy from an IT digital transformation ERP perspective, and really having a clear vision for what the project is going to be. That's an important first step, is defining what that digital strategy is, having a longer term strategy and roadmap, ensuring you're aligned with your company strategies, and any short term decisions you make, whether it's about the CRM system you're going to use, or the HCM, or the financials, or the warehouse management, or the ERP, handheld devices, getting involved with Internet of Things and cloud, moving things to the cloud. All that stuff should be part of a bigger picture, longer term strategy. So a lot of times companies want to rush right into just choosing software and just start implementing something because they're under the gun time wise. But it's very important to, first of all, define what the overall path and vision is. And it doesn't need to be a long, drawn-out process, as I mentioned before. This isn't an exercise I suggest you spend months and months on before you ever do anything, but you do need to make sure you kind of huddle up, take a time out, or whatever you want to call it, with your team, define what the strategy is, and lay out what the roadmap is, at least based on what you know now, and then figure out other decisions within the context of that longer term plan and strategy. The third thing I always suggest is to let your business drive technology, not technology drive the business. And it kind of dovetails back to the point I just made about not recommending that you move forward just because you have to replace your old system. But you want to make sure that you recognize that this is not an IT project, and that your business really should be driving what those changes are, what those improvements are going to be. A lot of times companies will come at it from a pure IT perspective and say, well, we've got to replace that old system, or we're just going to treat this like a Windows upgrade, or a deployment of new laptops. It's something that we can just kind of put the technology in place. We'll do a little bit of training, and then everyone's going to move on their way and everything's going to be fine. Typically, that isn't enough to be successful. And at the very least, you're going to be really disappointed with the results if that's the approach you take. So you want to make sure that the business process improvements you're looking at are enabling new technology and really driving the technology decisions you make, not the other way around. So you want to be looking at, what are those things that we expect to accomplish with these new business processes and with the new technology, with the new roles and responsibilities and organizational changes. At the end of the day, what is that end state vision, and how do we let those business decisions drive the technological decisions we make? So your digital transformation should be closely aligned with measurable strategic goals. So you want to make sure that you're looking at what the overarching strategy and goals of your project are before you dive right into just choosing technology. So the other part of this too is that when you look at business versus an IT project, if you're letting business drive the overall transformation, you're letting your processes dictate how you deploy and implement software. You're also, when you look at things like organizational change management or how you plan the project, how much time you invest in business process design, those decisions are very different, or the answers you arrive at are very different if you're letting the business drive this project versus IT. IT might want to get straight to the answer of how do we configure the software, and let's just get to that decision as quickly as we can, so that we can start configuring and rolling out the software. And that's okay, but it's not okay if your executives are expecting that this is going to be a business transformation. You're going to make some pretty dramatic improvements to your business processes in a good way. And if the intent, then you need to spend more time up front mapping out what your new business processes are going to look like. And that may sound like a very subtle way of slicing hairs, and it may sound like I said the same thing, but those are two subtly different things. And those are two different ways of making a decision. If I'm a business guy coming at this from a business perspective, I'm going to make sure I spend a lot of time up front before I select and implement new software. I'm going to make sure I spend a lot of time mapping out my business processes. But if I view this as a technical project, I'm going to get to the configuration decisions as quickly as possible so I can start rolling out technology. So you still have to do that latter part, but if you're viewing it from a business perspective, you want to spend that time and money up front. The other thing that's interesting about this point too is a lot of times people think, well, if I let the business drive the technology, that sounds great, but it also sounds really expensive. It sounds like it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be more complicated, more risky. And what I always say is it's actually less time, less money, less risk if you take this approach. On paper, it may look like, I have to add a few extra weeks to business process design, for example. But the reality is, at the end of the day, that's going to speed up your project downstream. It may look on paper like it's not. It may look like it's adding a certain amount of time. But the reality is, if you run two parallel projects next to each other, the one that spent more time and money up front with business process design is typically going to implement a lot faster and cheaper and at lower risk and get better results than the project that didn't. So that's the irony of all this, is it's actually less money, less time, more effective, more ROI to take this approach. And strategically, it typically gives you better results from a benefits realization perspective too. And finally, executives are typically happier with the results of a business-driven technology project rather than an IT-driven one. And I'm not talking, by the way, about IT departments per se. Your department needs to be involved, but you just need to make sure that the business is involved in driving some of those decisions. Another kind of root cause for a lot of failure that I've seen is that companies aren't realistic about what it's going to take to get the job done and to complete an implementation. Especially when I look at some of the expert witness cases I've been involved with, and in some of the project recoveries where I'm looking at extreme examples where these projects clearly went off track pretty big time. They're not just moderate failures. These are things that are bad enough to where either they've hired me and my team to come in and fix the project and take over from someone else, or in even more extreme cases, it's lawyers are involved and they're hiring me to come in and opine on, as an expert witness, what went wrong in these cases. And a lot of times in both those cases, you can trace it back to unrealistic expectations. We always get caught up in some of these cases with, well, we over customized, or we didn't spend enough on change management, and a lot of important meaty stuff. But a lot of times you can go back even further, trace it back to a deeper root cause, which is you never had realistic expectations to begin with. So you ended up cutting a lot of things out of scope later on. You ended up making a lot of bad decisions later on that weren't good for the project, all because you had unrealistic expectations, and you kind of boxed yourself in with this unrealistic understanding or thought of what it would take to select and implement and get benefits from new technology. So those unrealistic expectations are often the root causes of problems later on. A lot of it is just because it leads you to bad decisions because you have to. You've been boxed in terms of time and money. So you start doing things like cutting out change management, or we'll cut the training down, or we'll scale back on the next phase. We'll scale back the amount of time we spend defining our business processes. And again, it's good on paper. It may seem like you're going to save time and money, but actually those are really bad decisions that end up costing you a lot more later on. And then you end up hiring people like us to come in and clean up those projects rather than just hiring us to come in and do it right from the beginning. So, having realistic expectations around time, cost, and resources is really important. And you always want to take those proposed vendor proposals with a grain of salt, not because they're intentionally lying to you or lowballing intentionally, it's oftentimes because they don't know, either they don't know the complexity of your business, or oftentimes they don't, they haven't taken into account all the things that you're going to need to do. So they may have a plan for how they, as a vendor or reseller, system integrator, are going to implement the technology, but what that plan and timeline and budget does not oftentimes take into account is all the time and money you've got to spend yourself to do things like map out what your new business processes are going to be, or start data conversion, or handle some of the organizational change management beyond just the end user training that the system integrator might be doing. So those are the things that you really need to watch for, is the kind of the gaps between what's being proposed to you and what you actually need to have to get done. And those extra things that you need to do beyond what a vendor would typically do may sound like incremental more cost, and it certainly is in the short term. But when you look at the overall duration of a project, and even post implementation, it's going to be a lot cheaper and faster to invest those time and resources in spending that time up front to make sure you've got a clear plan, you've got a clear path, you've got resources identified, you've got a project governance structure in place, you've got an organizational change team, you've got a business process team, you've started doing some of that work, and you want to do all that stuff as much as you can before the meter starts running on the technical vendor resources in the reseller or system integrator resources, because that's just going to save you time and money. Having your kind of your house in order, if you will, before the implementation begins. So be realistic. That's probably, you could argue that if you're going to take away one thing, that's kind of a root cause for a lot of the other things we talk about, is just have realistic expectations. Make sure you've got a sanity check. Call me, send me an email. I'm happy to, give you a quick reality check as well. If there's a certain plan you're looking at, or duration, a lot of times, just having seen so many of these, I can give kind of a quick knee-jerk gut check based on my experience with similar types of companies and industries as you all. The fifth one is that implementation is much more important than software selection, and it gets back to one of the values I was talking about when I was discussing third stage. One of the values we have as a company is ensuring that we do what's right for the clients, and that we are sure to make sure that we only hire the best, the brightest, the people that really know this industry really well, people that have hands-on implementation experience and know exactly what it's going to take to get things done. And they also have the hands-on experience to know what different software solutions can and can't do. So with that in mind, if you've got good people that are helping you and advising you, you don't need to spend a lot of time and money on a software selection. It's a waste of time and money. It's too much effort. It's too cumbersome. You lose momentum. People start getting burned out. You get fatigued before the project ever begins. Skepticism starts to creep in. There's just a lot of things that can kind of get in the way during an overly cumbersome software selection process. So again, just recognize that you want to get the right answers for certain. You want to make sure your team gets aligned and that you have buy-in internally to what decision you make. But you don't need to be looking at 6 or 10 or 15 or 20 different vendors. Chances are you fit into a certain industry vertical, and you're a certain size, love complexity, you have a certain culture. Chances are I could spend 20 or 30 or 60 minutes with a lot of you, understand some basic things about your business, and probably quickly narrow that down to a very small handful of vendors that are a good fit. And it's probably going to be a different set of good fit vendors for each of you on the webinar today. It's probably a different mix based on your size, complexity, geography, all that good stuff, industry, culture, all that stuff factors in. So the point is, I'm not saying you just flip a coin or throw some darts and figure out who the vendor is, but certainly don't spend too much time on the process, and get to the decision quickly, and really focus on how do we plan for a really effective implementation? How do we invest time and money, making sure that implementation goes as flawlessly as possible? It's not going to be flawless, but how can we make it as flawless as possible? And for every hour we spend on a software selection, that's an hour and a dollar that we're not spending on the implementation. So let's figure out how to redirect more money and more time and more focus into that implementation process. So you don't want to spend too much time and money on the selection. You want to divert more attention to focus to a successful implementation. And as I mentioned before, a strong implementation with an imperfect evaluation process is typically better than the flip side of that. And really just, I guess a closing comment here on this point is just beware of consultants that drag out the selection process. If you're mid-sized company and you're being told it's going to take 4 or 5, 6 months to get to a decision, there's something wrong. And if you're having to go through the process of a long list with a bunch of RFIs and demos and demo scripts with thousands of different requirements, that's usually a symptom or not a smoke screen, but it's usually a sign, a warning sign that your consultants may not know what they're doing if they need all those different things to get to a decision or get to a recommendation. So really beware of consulting firms that drag out that process and ensure that you're getting through that process as quickly as you can, get to the right decision as quickly as you can, and really get people excited about, let's look forward to implementation and talk about what that's going to look like and just diving into that implementation as quickly as possible. The sixth thing is there's no silver bullets. So, the big thing right now is, cloud. You hear a lot about cloud and SaaS, ERP systems and technologies, and how that's going to save time and money in the long run. And it makes deployment so much easier. It certainly doesn't hurt to have a cloud type of solution as an example, but it's not a silver bullet. You still have to do the heavy lifting as it relates to business process improvements, training people on the new processes, redesigning roles and responsibilities, all that stuff you still have to do. And that's probably 70, 80% or more of the effort in the implementation is related to people and process. The technology piece, the remaining 20%, let's call it, that of a project that is focused on technology, that part certainly does get somewhat easier because now you're not talking about building an infrastructure. You're not installing software on premise on your own servers, which does reduce complexity, saves you some time and money. But you still have to configure the software. You still have to set it up. You still have to go through all that heavy lifting. So just be aware of any sort of silver bullet that you're being sold, because that's typically, over 20 years of doing this, silver bullets come and go, and buzzwords and trends come and go, but the facts still say the same. If I could give this exact same presentation 20 years ago or 20 years from now, and it's probably going to be the same types of best practices here. And this is probably still going to be a true point that there are no silver bullets. You still have to look at the really difficult parts of transformation. And that's ultimately what's going to make your project succeed or not, is having a good focus on people and process. So just be aware of silver bullets, ensure that you're not falling into that trap. That's an important takeaway as well. And then the seventh thing is to take your time and control the project tempo. A lot of times there's fits and starts. Your people may be really eager to get off that old system that they are so tired of. You may be under pressure from your legacy vendor to get off that old system. You may be under pressure from your new software vendor to implement as quickly as possible so they can turn the meter on and start billing you for maintenance and all that stuff. So you got a lot of this pressure around you to really speed things up and go as fast as you can. And what I always tell clients is this is your project. Don't let a consulting firm or a sort of vendor or others dictate how you run the project. I mean, you control the pace. You don't want to prematurely start in implementation. You want to make sure you've got your processes defined and you've got your ducks in a row, so to speak. And it's also important to note that it's better and cheaper and faster to get it right the first time. So, we'd much rather see you maybe take a little bit longer than you'd like, but you're getting it right the first time. You're not having to go back and redo anything. You don't have a failure on your hands. And I'm not by any means suggesting take your time and just go slow and draw this out longer than it needs to be, but also don't rush. I mean, it's kind of like a marathon, not a sprint. So the way to think of it is, you could come out of the gates and just sprint that first half mile or 3/4 of a mile, and you're going to be way ahead of the pack probably, but you're going to lose steam pretty quickly, and you're going to fail ultimately in that marathon if you come out of the gates too strong and too fast. So you just really want to understand those conflicting priorities. Focus on the fact that this is a transformation. It's not an IT project. You're probably trying to get some pretty significant business improvements out of this project. So that stuff takes time, and you want to take the time to do that. And it gets back to the point about having realistic expectations, because that's an important part of this as well. So those are the 7 things. But as I was putting together the list here, I actually, when I was first putting this together a couple of weeks ago, obviously change management, by the way, is where I started my career. So I'm always thinking about change management. I almost had a full deck that was just all talking about change management because it's so important. But then I started coming to, realizing that if I were really going to prioritize these things, based on my experience, there's other things related to this other than change management. But at the end of the day, change management still is the most important thing. So even though it's not my top 7, it was kind of more of a teaser more than anything, and 7 sounds better than 8. So really the 8th and most important thing that we wanted to have here is that organizational change management has to be a key area of focus. The people component needs to be addressed. Your project will fail without it. I mean, I've not seen a project succeed and go well where they didn't invest in change management. You can skimp on some other things. I mean, even some of these best practices I shared with you, you might be able to cut some corners or skirt a little bit or water it down and be okay. But change management's the exception. You really can't be successful without having strong organizational change. And so the problem with change management is people don't really know what it means, and it sounds pretty fluffy, and people think it just means training and communications, which is certainly part of it, but there's a lot more to it. There's org design, there's business readiness, change impact, benefits realization, executive alignment, stakeholder analysis. There's a lot that goes into change management, a lot that needs to happen well before your training. So it's easy to get caught up in the technology and maybe even the business process side of things, which are both important, but it's easy to forget about change management because you can't see or touch it or feel it until you go live and people are freaking out because they don't understand the system and the project fails. Then you'll feel it. But during the project itself, it's hard to see and feel. So it is one of those things where you want to make sure you've got good outside counsel and expertise and help in making sure that project goes as well as possible from a change management perspective. And by the way, I have a whole separate webinar just on organizational change management. So watch the schedule for that. That'll be on the calendar here in the next month, another webinar just on organizational change, because I could obviously spend a lot more time than just 5 minutes talking about organizational change, since it is the most important part of what I would say or it will make or break your digital transformation or ERP project. So that, just to summarize, these are the 8 things that are important here. You want to understand that success is due to these best practices. You want a clear digital strategy to guide you through the next 3 to 5 years of this journey that you're about to undertake. You want to make sure that the business is driving the technology and driving the overall project. You want to make sure you're being realistic about the projects and the resources and time. You also want to make sure that you're recognizing that the implementation, investing time and money in the implementation planning and the implementation itself is much more important than the software selection process. There's no silver bullet in this process. You want to control the tempo and make sure that you're running this project at your pace. And then finally, organizational change management is the most important thing that you can do, is ensure that you address the organizational change components of your project. And if you do that one thing, the organizational change management piece, if you do that well, I'm not going to say that guarantees success, but it makes it a lot easier to succeed, and your odds of succeeding suddenly go up pretty dramatically. So you may, as I mentioned before, you may all be used to seeing my blogs and emails and white papers and whatnot. I encourage you to subscribe to our mailing list at thirdstage-consulting.com, or keep checking that out, because there's a ton of blogs and content that we're putting out there. And I can't go a day really without writing or creating a blog or some kind of thought leadership of some sort, because every day I'm learning something. I'm talking to clients all the time. I'm visiting clients, and I'm always learning something new or having just a little bit different perspective on things, or a new sliver of something that I hadn't really observed before. So encourage you to really stay tuned to our website. All the thought leadership you're used to seeing from me is now underneath Third Stage and on our Third Stage website. So I encourage you to use this as your kind of your de facto source for best practices in ERP implementations and digital transformations as well. So make sure you've got the website there, and since you register for today's webinar, you'll probably start receiving updates on upcoming webinars and content as well, but I encourage you to check out the website as well. So at this point, we'll go ahead and shift gears and start to answer any questions we have here in these last few minutes. And let me see what kind of questions we have here. So the first question is, what are some of the key things that I should be focused on as part of my organizational change management within my project? And I had a feeling someone was going to ask that, because I know I glossed over what is the most important thing. And again, it's difficult to unpack that meaty subject in just a few minutes. But I guess if I had to kind of narrow it down and maybe just get you started on what the most important things are just to start the process, I'd say one thing is a business readiness assessment, where you look at through surveys and online surveys and focus groups, really understand the lay of the land and what the culture is, and where the possible points of resistance might be. So, and there's some tools that we use that are automated. We've got some scripted focus groups and things like that that we draw from. So that would be the first thing, is do an assessment of the current lay of the land, understand where the pockets of resistance are likely to come from. And then from there, you can define a specific change management strategy and plan that fits exactly where you are as an organization. The other thing I would do that I would make sure I focus on is a change impact assessment. That's something that, if you're a change management consultant, you're probably doing a lot of that, but most organizations don't think to do that as part of their change management. They don't think to define the gaps between the current state and the future state on a role by role or department by department or work group by work group basis. So that's something I'd suggest too, is making sure that you identify those change impacts and that you have a strong feel for how people's jobs are going to change, so you can start communicating that to them well before the training, so that by the time you get to training, you're simply reiterating or reinforcing what they already know. And you're simply showing them how those new processes and new roles are going to work within the new system. But you've already done the hard part with communicating to them what the changes are, why they're happening. You let them freak out and tell you why that's a bad idea or why they don't want to change. And you kind of reconcile that and you work through those changes. So change impact is a very important one. I'd say those are probably the two best places to start. And then obviously, communications and making sure you're communicating the people's impact from the project is very important as well. So another question here is, what are the remainder of the 20 things you said are best practices for ERP implementations? And that is something that will be in the white paper when it's released it should be the end of next week. You'll see that white paper release. So you can actually, on our website, if you'd like, you can register for that white paper. And as soon as it's out, you'll receive an email with a link to download it. So what I will tell you, there's a lot in there about change management. There's a few more topics, and I kind of break it up a little bit more detail. I think there's 2 or 3 points around change management in there. But there's just a lot of other things. I guess I'll just leave it at that and leave you in suspense as to what some of those other things are. And then another question here is, of the 1,000+ implementations you've been involved with, how many of those were you the project manager for? That's a good question. There's probably a few. There's several dozen. I don't know if it's 100 or not, but it's several dozen where I was the actual day-to-day project manager. The remainder of them were I was involved as I mentioned before, either on a steering committee. That's actually a bulk of them, I think, are ones where I'm a steering committee member, just because I've probably worked with, in the last 10 years, probably several hundred different clients where I was on the steering committee, involved in major decisions around the project, dealing with the risks and overcoming some of those things. So it's good because, in some ways I've got a narrow field of several dozen projects where I have the deep experience of being either a project manager or a team lead on one of the work streams or whatever. But then over the years, I've gotten that broad experience from being on steering committees for all these different types of organizations, types of projects, different types of systems being implemented. So that depth and breadth is really what contributed to the findings here. Which, by the way, there is a question on here that I just lost, but there's a question, I'm paraphrasing, but the question about how I arrived at these 7 things that are best practices for implementations. And it's not a quantitative study by any means, but it is. I went through a pretty rigorous process of looking at my past expert witness reports, project recoveries that I've been involved with, notes from steering committees, all these different types of qualitative discussion, and really narrowing it down to what were the challenges that all these projects faced and what were some of the best practices that could have addressed, or in some cases did mitigate some of those challenges. So there's no quantitative aspect to it. So this is more of a qualitative study than I've ever been involved with in the past, but it's also a very broad data set, or a broad sample size that we look at over the last 20 years. So I think that answers most of the main questions. We're right at the top of the hour, so I'll go ahead and wrap up now. I want to thank you very much for all of your attendance. Encourage you to join other webinars, check out our website, learn more about Third Stage, and we're happy to help at any point make your projects more successful. So feel free to reach out to me. You've got my contact information in front of you. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the replay of today's webinar. And in that link, you also have my email address. So feel free to reach out at any point, and look forward to working with you all in the future. So have a great rest of your day in the meantime, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.